Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramanaya. Dear brothers and sisters in Sri Bhagavan, it gives me great pleasure in sharing with you some thoughts on the significance of Sri Bhagavan's advent to Arunachala. We celebrated the 125th anniversary of Sri Bhagavan's advent to Arnachala on September 1st this year. This is the day the union merger took place between father and son and once for all created the Ramana Arunachala for eternity. This event culminated the 6 most impactful weeks in the spiritual era for genuine seekers of truth on the path of non-duality or Advaita Vedanta. 6 weeks prior in Madurai, in July, by an intense sadhana lasting barely half an hour, Sri Bhagavan completed a sadhana of many lifetimes for most sadhaks. It was the same self-inquiry he later enjoined on his followers. Quote, "It is the one infallible means, the only direct one to realize the unconditioned absolute being that you really are." End of quote. He said that it immediately sets up the process of transmutation, even though it may be long before this is completed. But the moment the ego self tries to know itself, it begins to partake less and less of the body in which it is immersed and more of the consciousness of the self. Bhagavan quotes his experience as follows in Arunachala Ashtakam verse 2. Kandavan evan enak karuthinul nada, Kandavan inrida ninradu kandeen. This translates as, when I scrutinized within my mind, who is the seer? The seer became non-existent and saw which remained, that is the self. No one can end his journey till the allotted time. It was the morning of September 1st, 1896, 3 days after leaving home when Sri Bhagavan arrived at Tiruvannamalai station. With quick steps, his heart throbbing with joy, he hastened straight to the great temple. In a mute sign of welcome, the gates of the 3 high compound walls and all the doors, even that of the inner shrine, stood open. There was no one else inside, so he entered the inner shrine alone and stood overcome before his father Arunachaleshwara. There, in the bliss of union, was the quest achieved and the journey thus ended. This description was no poetic license on the part of Sri Bhagavan. Author John Grimes, while researching his book Ramana Maharshi and the Crown Jewel of Advaita, was able to trace records of the temple. It seems that on September 1, 1896, there was a serious audit of the temple accounts, and as the temple authorities were busy doing it, the coast was completely clear for Bhagavan to enter the inner sanctorum directly. Thus, a simple act of prior planning on a physical plane resulted in setting up an unobstructed meeting in the metaphysical spiritual plane between the father and son. Friends, today let us dedicate ourselves to the practice of Sri Bhagavan's teachings. Bhagavan has clearly stated there are only 2 reliable methods for attaining self-realization. One could pursue self-inquiry or one could surrender, that is, self-surrender. Quoting Bhagavan, know that the path of jnana and path of devotion are interrelated. Follow these inoperable 2 paths without dividing one from the other. Today, I am going to concentrate on the path of self-surrender. September 1st is a day that signifies the importance of self-surrender or surrender in general. There can be no better example of surrender than our Bhagavan. As a 16-year-old boy, Bhagavan gave up his family, friends, coming to Arunachala, announcing, "Father, I have come." For the next 54 years, his father Arunachala took care of him. In Aksharamana he says, verse 94, "Varumbadi sollillai vandhen padiyala varundidum talavidi Arunachala. Didst thou not call me in? I have come in now. Measure out for me, as my maintenance is now thy burden, O Arunachala." Verse 95. "Vaven rahambukun var varulendre yen var vilandhen arul Arunachala." The moment thou didst welcome, didst enter into me and grant me thy divine life, I lost my individuality, O Arunachala. In Navamani Malai verse 7, he quotes, "As soon as you did claim me, my body and soul became yours. What can I desire?" In the book Nanyar, his first teaching in 1902, where all the words were written on the sand in reply to questions by Sri Shiva Prakasham Pillai, Bhagavan talks about surrender. Quote, "Let any amount of burden be laid on him, he will bear it all. It is in fact the indefinable power of the Lord that ordains, sustains and controls everything that happens. Why then should we worry, tormented by vexatious thoughts, saying, 'Shall we act this way? No, that way,' instead of meekly but happily submitting to that power? Knowing that the train carries all the weight, why indeed should we, the passengers traveling in it, carry our small individual articles of luggage on our laps to our own great discomfort instead of putting them aside and sitting at perfect ease?" End of quotation. I quote from talk, page 425, quote, "Surrender to him and abide by his will, whether he appears or vanishes. Await his pleasure. If you ask him to do as you please, it is not surrender, but command to him. You cannot have him obey you and yet think that you have surrendered. He knows what is best and when and how to do it. Leave everything to him. His is the burden. You no longer have any cares. All your cares are his. Such is surrender. This is bhakti." As we go on this path, we encounter a new and apparently insoluble problem. The desire to surrender is itself a desire we want fulfilled. According to Bhagavan, true surrender cannot be accomplished without complete desirelessness. It is the paradox of effort inherent in all forms of sadhana. Simply stated, the problem is that there is a perception that there is an individual self which wants to extinguish itself so that the state of realization will be revealed. But everything that this individual self does to eliminate itself merely prolongs its existence. This is due to the false assumption that this individual has a real existence. So, the first act on the path of true self-surrender is not to throw oneself at someone's feet and say, "I surrender." It is the cultivation of awareness that there is no individual self to surrender, and this individual self never at any time had, has, or will have any real existence. Bhagavan says in Talks 176, who is to surrender what and to whom? Bhagavan drives home the fact that meditation, surrender, or self-inquiry done without this constant awareness are merely exercises in self-deception. Further, on this path of removal of this illusory person who is going to surrender, practice of Bhagavan's teachings helps one to bypass the mind and move to the realm of the being. One cannot truly surrender without escaping from the vast ideas and desires we call the mind. Bhagavan's solution is to let the mind subside to the point where it disappears, and what is left behind is the pure, simple being that was always there. Quoting Bhagavan, Talks 175, quote, "It is enough that one surrenders oneself. Surrender is to give oneself up to the original cause of one's being, one's source within oneself. Give yourself up to it. That means that you should seek the source and merge in it." For Bhagavan, practice of self-surrender is to find within oneself the feeling of beingness and surrender oneself completely to it. This final stage of surrender is simply to give up attachment to ignorance by bypassing the mental processes which cause and perpetuate it. One surrenders the erroneous idea that there is an individual self to surrender. Thus, the route to the rediscovery of the self is the same whether one chooses to label it surrender or self-inquiry. The final state of realization to take place is the definite elimination of ignorance, and it is a matter for the self. Bhagavan says that one's effort can only take us to a certain point, and after that, the self, which one can call God, Guru, as Bhagavan says, the self, God, Guru are all the same. The self takes over and takes us to the final goal. Friends, today I want to re-emphasize that the act of surrender is not a passive one, but a dynamic process which has to be done with the complete loss of the notion of mind or the person, and that will take us to the self-realization. This is being assured by our Bhagavan. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramanaya.